Hey everyone, I apologize. I kind of lost track of time, which is why I'm sitting in my car right now.
I was guessing that based upon the reverb.
Yeah, sorry about that. There, that's what it looks like. Completely lost track of time. I was sitting in Starbucks, just kind of drinking my coffee, and realized, oh my gosh. All right. So, the agenda. I saw that John added some things. I'm going to see if I can find the agenda URL. If anyone happens to have it handy, please paste it in the chat. Otherwise, I'll keep looking for it.
Is there a known place where we keep these links?
Yeah, you'd kind of think we'd do that.
Maybe maybe now is a good time to.
Yeah, well, maybe actually might be in the meeting notes. Actually,
it's in the meeting minutes.
It's in the meeting minutes. I meant, yeah. So it's in the calendar invite. Okay. So here goes the paste. If someone hasn't already beat me to it.
You guys have them open?
Beat me to it. Thanks, John, or somebody. Mark. All right. So going down the agenda, Kevin may or may not be able to make it. He gave me a quick ping just before the meeting.
Yeah, I'm on the phone, John.
Oh, excellent. Thanks, Kevin.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get back to the office.
Thanks. Okay, the first item, let's see here. John, you've got a bunch of interesting things that you would like to talk about. So let's first talk about the election of new committers, and then, John, you can kind of prioritize the topics that you have. And as usual, it is everybody's job to take minutes. And please add your name to the list of attendees.
Yeah, I've added you, John, because you're currently driving. I don't know if you have.
Well, I'm not actually driving. I'm actually parked. But thank you anyway.
You're welcome.
Please spell my name correctly. All right. So, there's a thread going on right now in the Hangouts as it relates to committers about,
what?
Basically right now, anybody that's a committer can commit to any project. And there's a discussion going on about should we begin to become a little bit more narrowly focused such that a committer basically becomes a committer on a specific microprofile feature, right? That would require some potential mechanics around projects, sub-projects, and stuff like that. There's various points of view. I'll go ahead and state mine, and others can kind of state theirs. The point of view that I had is I almost think we're pre-optimizing around committers, meaning that we know that at some point in the not too distant future, maybe it's a year or whatever, that if MicroProfile somehow more directly aligns with EE4J, right? There may be process changes as a part of that, right? So in some ways, I just like to kind of keep things the way they are. The second reason is I'm not sure I understand the problem we're trying to solve. Like, have we had people committing to projects they shouldn't be committing to? So those are the 2 points I thought I would bring up and open up for discussion.
The huge problem with this procedure, like Eclipse does it, is that there is no back channel discussions. So there is no way that you can exchange, oh, look at this guy and that lady does an awesome job. She's on the right track. She is not, or he is not yet there, but he might be a candidate in the future if he continues to contribute. as he does now. And then it's much easier if you have a private back channel to discuss this much more openly. Currently, there is only the public channel, and to be honest, who wants to say no? That guy or lady is not yet there. That's really a problem.
I think you raised a separate, so that's valid. That's a valid topic, but I think John was teeing up first. What should we do? Should we have one vote that gives person access to everything, or 20 votes? Because we may have 20 different projects someday.
Okay, yeah.
And that's a very specific concern. And so
yeah,
I guess I'll voice my perspective on it. It feels like premature optimization. I think that's a lot of chatter we don't want to have as a community. I mean, it just feels like a lot of overhead, because right now we're doing, in my opinion, a pretty poor job of getting people in as a committer aggressively enough. And then suddenly it's going to be that times as many sub projects as we have harder. I don't think that's a good trade-off in terms of overhead. I would also state the perspective that, in my experience, fewer barriers leads to more innovation, and more barriers leads to more stability. So I think we're designing towards the wrong thing, because MicroProfile is supposed to foster innovation and spark creativity and get people to be motivated to collaborate cross spec and just pollinate ideas. If each spec is a flower, we want the bees to have access to all the flowers. That's my opinion.
So if we were
go ahead.
I was going to say, at this point, I just wanted to comment on a little bit about what. So Steve spoke to me today. I think he was intending to be on this call, but I think he might have been caught out by the daylight savings change. But yeah, I think the key point of the thread that's at the moment in Google Groups is that at the moment we don't have an agreed microprofile policy for nominating new committers. So there is obviously the PMC have got guidelines and things, and you have to make a significant contribution kind of thing. But because we don't have this microprofile specific, okay, this is how you become a committer, it's quite hard for, say, an individual not tied to a company, or who doesn't maybe already know someone who's working on some project to become a contributor and maybe get that committer status. So what it looks like at the moment to people who are maybe not too familiar with perhaps the Fault Tolerance Project or the people that have been nominated currently, is that there are kind of like brand new names that have popped up that again have people to vouch for them, and that's kind of fine. I assume that all those people that know about the people being nominated and are sure that they're going to be great, but it does seem like those particular people are getting like a bit of a leg up to become a committer, whereas that kind of channel of access to become a committer would not also be available to an individual. So obviously these people have worked on these specs, and I'm sure they've put in a lot of effort in. I think Kevin mentioned to John's point about one of the members having done 3 PRs, but actually there was 16 commits in the IP review. So they have been active in some way, but in others they've been completely invisible. Like I hadn't seen any of the names before. So kind of before we even get to decide what this policy should be, the point is we should have a policy. That there should be something that we all agree on, that's fair, that's clear, that's everyone can see, that is public and an open kind of piece of record. I mean, it's the way that we've done things all the while so far, and it's worked in the past. So that's kind of the general thrust of it.
I think that I would. Well, go ahead, John, if you wanted to list.
Well, the other thing I was going to say is what is the role of a committer? Maybe we should define what a committer can do, right? That makes it maybe different from non-committers, right? In the context of the Eclipse Foundation. And the two things I can think of is commit code and vote for other committers, right?
Well, there's a governance associated with that as well. So, steering MicroProfile in general is what you can do as a committer. You can vote on more than just
And by
code commits.
And by being able to commit, you can basically define where the road is going. So if there is a non-committer with an opinion A and a committer with an opinion B, and both ways are valid, then it will probably become the way B. So a committer has more power. That's it.
So it's come up before. So I don't want to stretch the topic because I want to get on to Mike's point real quick, in the sense that I absolutely agree that I raised the topic last Tuesday call, that I feel we need to just generally increase the number of committers overall. There's a lot of people that have helped out MicroProfile in their first year that, for whatever reason, did not stay active. I think there's somewhat of a self-fulfilling prophecy there, in the sense that, we haven't given them any sort of acknowledgement, so therefore they tend to stop contributing after a while. So on my particular list of people, Ivar Grimstad has just basically been beating everybody combined on who has spoken about MicroProfile the most. We totally need to be giving him commit, to acknowledge he's part of our community, right? And other people have helped out on the conference demo when we all got together in November last for the DevOps presentation. Ivan Ivanov was there every day, helping to work on the code for the profile, for the conference app. He was at our booth at Java 1. So he's a person in the community that is clearly shown this is important to me. So I think we should be giving these people, some sort of commit, but I don't view commit as, being only exclusively tied to people who are doing code changes. I view as anybody who's very into our community, very into helping. They're investing themselves and their time in the community.
So you see it as a part recognition, because one of the things that you were saying is that they have, and I think Mark even stepped in on, is that they can help set the direction, right? Why does a committer of code, which is essentially what a committer in the Eclipse Foundation is, right? A committer of code.
I don't know that they would agree with.
Okay.
I do believe that Eclipse views the people who are taking a role in the project to be the community.
Where is the difference between writing the code for, let's say, failsafe versus writing the documents and the samples like Ivar does? He did this all on his blog, but he could also provide those samples as documentation for the project itself if he would be committer, to pick this up what David mentioned.
Well, do a pull request. That's providing the content. And after a certain number of commits that need to be defined, I agree that it is a bit nebulous. Then he becomes a committer.
Right. And on the, I have been in a lot of projects that have gone down the policy, or have had, when we've had the policy conversation about what is the minimum number of commits, what is the this, what is the that, and ultimately nobody agrees. And what the end result was every time is, I will express my opinion about whether I think that is enough with my vote, and that's my right to do so. If I'm agreeing on what the template is, then I'm giving up my vote, because it's just basically, here are the check boxes and they've been checked and my vote doesn't matter anymore. But I do think what Mike's point is that there needs to be some, and what Mark's point has been made as well, there needs to be some kind of little bit easier path for proposing people to be commit. And I think that when we have more people who are independent on the project, to Mike's concern, that will make more people proposing people who are independent. That's, I think that will fix itself once we add more committers that are of independent nature.
What we could also do is just do a discussion on committer candidates with each microprofile hangout and stop the recording and have a private discussion over here. But it would be better if it's accessible by all committers in a private way.
I think that we've been missing having a private list where we can have these types of discussions. It's been a little awkward, to be honest, to not have a place where we can just discuss something that's not public. So I see a lot of private chatter.
There is no single bar about committership. Someone contributes code, the other one contributes presentations, the third one contributes documentation. What is the bar for each of them? So there is never one predefined bar where all agree. But if we discuss, if we can say, oh, look at this guy or lady, he contributed this and that, what about making him a committer? And then the others can join in and say, oh, nah, let's wait a bit, or the others can support him. And finally, we come to the point where we say, yeah, he's ready for a vote. But we miss this channel currently.
Is the MicroProfile Dev mailing list at Eclipse private to only Eclipse committers?
No, it's public, fully public. No. There is no private list at Eclipse, as far as I understood.
Right.
Just make a Google group and seed with everybody who's currently a committer.
Well, that would be another idea. I mean, we could just do our own private mailing list, forgetting about the process at Eclipse.
I wouldn't mind first asking about perhaps the Eclipse Foundation hosting a private one for this particular purpose, or would that not fly?
Well, we have. We did when we first started up, and they didn't go with it. Now, I do know that they do have that capability because there is a private discussion going on with some of the EE4J stuff, or at least it was, and now we're moving more public. But
yeah, I'm a more of an ask for forgiveness kind of guy than permission, because we know we need it, and when we don't do it instead, we end up with private email threads of 5 people on one thread, or 3 people on another thread, and 7 people on another thread. But it's never really balanced, and it's always, yeah. No, private discussion just happen. Go ahead.
I was going to say I'm fully in favour of that as well, purely because the reason, or the original reason I put that on the agenda was based on Arthur's comment. I know I saw he was in the chat room as well in this call. And that was because he just raised a thread on the Google groups and said, hey, I'm doing a lot of stuff. It'd be really helpful if I was a committer. I think that's a great process to have. It's just simple. And yeah, if we had like a nice private place to discuss this, and I could just potentially say, oh, this is a great candidate here. I'm going to nominate him just so that you're all aware. These are my reasons. And, maybe start the discussion that way. I think that would work really well, and people like Arthur, I think, would probably get through quite quickly with that way.
We just have to make sure that we do not overuse the private lists, but for some cases, it's really, really useful.
Yeah, it's one of those balances.
Okay. I mean, does anyone disagree with the idea? Should we just maybe start moving forward with the idea?
I'm staring at the Google group page right now, so if anybody objects, now's a good time.
No, go ahead, David. And now, I mean, just to be clear, then we will only include the defined committers right now.
Correct.
I mean, no exceptions.
No exceptions. Does anybody have I don't know what other rules would be fair.
John had to move to the phone, so he's no longer on video. But anyway, he's in the chat. He agrees as well.
Yeah.
I don't know if
Okay.
people want to.
And if we feel people should really be on that list, then we should start making them committers. You know.
Right.
Sorry, I just realized I had muted myself in the app. Just one thing, do we need to include PMC members in that list? Like Wayne, for instance.
Sure, I don't mind it.
Well, I don't think we do. I mean, okay, so one thing, if we bring Wayne into it, he's going to scream. And he's going to say, no, there's no private conversations. So that's not a good idea.
Okay, that's
Then he should give
perfectly
us a
fine. I'm
private
just throwing it
channel.
out there as, do we need to consider this?
Yeah.
No, stop. I think it's good to have him on board, and also to make him aware if Eclipse doesn't acknowledge that need, we have to make them understand our problem. There are things we do not want to discuss in public, especially if it is about people. I mean, if you say no, this guy isn't simply not ready yet, maybe in a year, then this is a slap in the face of these people. So
Yeah.
you should not do
So,
this
Mark?
in public. And for those things, we definitely need a private list, and Eclipse needs to acknowledge this. We don't need to
No.
hide this from Eclipse.
Well, Mark, I agree with you, but I think we ought to prove that the process works for us first and then go back to Eclipse. Otherwise, we're going to go back to what David said is, well, now we'll be asking for permission and they're going to say no. And then we're stuck.
Okay,
So I think we ought to just start it and then bring it up to Wayne.
Sure.
Yeah, but Kevin, you know that this is the established process in the Apache Software Foundation, and we know that it's working that way. It's pretty well working.
I know.
So
Right.
But whenever we bring up something comparing Eclipse to Apache, that's like a slap in the face to Eclipse because they don't like to hear that. So,
regardless, over the last year, I've certainly been involved in more than one private email thread with a half dozen people on it, and it's not going to stop anytime soon. I would prefer that these not be a half dozen people, but at least the committers, and that there's some way to grow that. And I'm certainly not going to type in every person's email address one at a time. And I can't be mad at anybody else if they don't do it either. So I think we're setting ourselves up for failure by not having a way to just talk.
Yep.
That's just the way it is. There are some things like when we wanted to file the config JSR, we didn't want to make it public while we're working on it. And there was a lot of people on an email thread at a certain point. It gets a little unwieldy.
Right.
All right, where's our current list of committers? I guess it's just right there on the project page.
yeah, either that or from the foundation portal. Either one has the list.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so anyway, we're in general agreement on this private group, private email list, whatever David's going to create. And we will start to use that. And at some point, we will go back to Wayne and explain our reasoning for using this and how it has benefited us. Any confirmation on that?
That's what I heard. That's fine.
Make it so.
Thumbs up.
Okay, so now if we're going to go that route, then earlier on the call, I was in the car, so I didn't hear everything, but I think the discussion topic came up about, trying to establish some bar, some guidelines for proposing a committer. Are we now indicating that maybe we don't have to be as explicit there because we're going to just bring up the person for discussion on the private email list first?
Exactly. And then discuss about them, and if the outcome is positive, then have a vote.
Right. Yeah, and then of course the vote's public, like what we do today.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, I like that approach much better because I was concerned, although I was agreeing with Steve and Mike that having some type of criteria would probably be good. I was concerned that okay, no matter what we put, there's going to be exceptions, and then it's kind of like okay, we need a discussion anyway. So I think this is going to be good to just be able to have this private conversation, and then we can discuss the exceptions.
All right, I think we've kind of talked through this one. I think we're all in agreement. So, any objections if I move on to the next subject? Okay, no objections. Silence is consent. All right, John Hammond, pick your word. I think you've got like 4 or 5, so I'll let you go ahead and prioritize what you think are the most important ones.
Sure. So I'll start with hopefully the simplest one, which is moving to the new release process via Jenkins. I don't know if anyone's had a chance to look at the document that I had shared, but I basically wrote up what I did to make it work.
Yep.
And I was able to get a almost fully automated release process working. There's 2 catches that I have. One is for the OSGI annotations. You have to go in and you have to manually change the code. There's no way to fix that. The other is after the repo has been created, you still have to go in and verify it. So you're going to have to close it once you've confirmed that the right contents are there. And I believe, Andre, you have a script that I can pilfer that will stage the spec files in a proper location so they can be downloaded. So that would be the last thing to actually get integrated. But outside of that, I've been able to fully automate it so that all you do is you log into Jenkins, you hit a button, you specify some version numbers, and your release will be ready in a few minutes.
That sounds good. I read your doc, John. The one thing that I wasn't clear on, and probably just because of lack of education or experience, how did these OSGI annotations come into play? I'm not clear on that.
That's actually an IBM requirement. Emily has been adding those to the various specs to make it work, I'm assuming, for Liberty. I personally don't know what they're for. Mike, you might have some, Mike or Andre, you might have some ideas as well, because it seems like similar requirements are in place for Pyara, but I'm not, like, the last time I dealt with OSGI was about 5 years ago, and that was very rudimentary. Prior to that, it was a little bit off and on. So it's not very familiar to me, unfortunately.
Okay.
And we actually, we had a follow-up call with a REST client earlier today talking about these specific kinds of problems. And one of the changes that we are making is to make it so that this package is not a hard dependency. So when you bring it in, applications such as Swarm or Hammock that aren't based on OSGI don't have to bring in the OSGI dependencies. So that will at least fix a dependency management problem that we're starting to see.
So I have another question. Nope, I'm getting a lot of noise.
Yes, Andrew, I think that might be one. Thanks.
Yeah. So, John, the other question I had with RC builds that we're doing. From reading your doc, it sounded like those would be going to the Sonatype repository as well?
Yes. The difference would be that you never release them. So it would create the staging repo, you would close it, but you wouldn't release it for Maven Central. And that's actually what we're doing right now as well. I think the only difference is that we skipped the script that uploads it to Central.
Yep.
I mean, if we wanted to, we can actually skip the deploy for those RC builds. But I thought the whole idea behind the RC build is to have something you can actually test with, so you can confirm your application is working correctly.
Yeah, and
so we kind of want that to be in a staging repo.
Right, much easier. Okay.
Then I guess the only question would be, how do we want to roll this out?
Yeah, so there would be an impact to all of the scripts that we currently have in place?
Yep. And potentially there's some room for optimization here, where instead of bringing the release script into every repo, I can just set it up directly on Jenkins and have effectively one Jenkins job that goes out and can execute a release against any arbitrary repository.
Oh, wow.
I think the one limitation I have right now is the MicroProfile Genie is only hooked up to the REST client repo. I have to confirm with the infra team if they've been able to fix the problem with writing to all the repos. So that would be the only catch.
Okay.
But there wouldn't actually have to be any code committed to any repo for this, outside of some basic POM file changes.
Yep.
It also reduces hopefully reduces the amount of effort that we have to go through when it comes to creating a new spec.
Right, right. So when we pull in these new ones, we don't have to duplicate everything and have copies. We can just reference the one. I think this sounds good. As far as the rollout, I mean, it seems like once we get the common scripting in place, then I suppose we could just create issues against each of the components, explaining what updates they need to do to their POM files, and then, basically, deprecate, remove, or whatever their current Jenkins files.
Yeah, I think that's fine. So I'll take that up to handle the creation of those tickets and the creation of the real Jenkins job.
The test, can you hear me now correctly?
Yep.
Okay, so I had a comment to this, basically an idea. It would simplify to spread the configuration across the repositories, to have one sample repository with only the basics things to do the continuous integration. That would be like a template to and reference for other repositories.
That would probably be worthwhile, because I think all of us have found out that when we start up a new project and we're starting to look at, okay, what do I have to fit into my POM to get it to work? It's always been a little different going from one project to another. And if we had one that just kind of demonstrated, and actually could even be used as a playground, to test different things, I think it'd be worthwhile.
So you're effectively thinking of creating like a MicroProfile skeleton project.
Yeah, basically something like that.
Okay. Yeah, I think that would be doable, and that would also give a reference to everyone as far as what they have to set up.
Maybe it doesn't even have to be a new repository. It could be as a subdirectory in the POM repository, or BOM repository. But yeah, it will be mainly used for new repositories, so it also makes sense to make it as a new repository so that it can be a reference for a base, as a base for a new repository. But we could start just by creating it in the microprofile bomb repository as a subdirectory and then move it to a new repository if it's better.
All right. Any thoughts?
All right. The next thing up. Yeah.
John.
Yeah, go ahead, John. John Klingen, we can barely hear you.
Okay, that's a good thing. Because it's John Hammond that's taking over the show.
Yeah, so I guess the other thing I wanted to bring up was also release related around the TCK patch fixes. It looks like Metrics is planning a 101 TCK release. Apache Tamaya is waiting for a fix on the config TCK to be able to have 100% compliance. And there may be changes as well to fault tolerance TCK. So I'm wondering, have we given any thought as to what those release processes look like? When I was chatting with Heiko yesterday, and he mentioned the metrics release, I was starting to ask him a little bit about it, and he didn't really have any idea about what we were going to do to cut that release. So I'm wondering if anyone had any plans there.
No, I think this is, treading new water again. From the standpoint of our Eclipse projects and doing releases, this type of a release really doesn't require anything from an Eclipse standpoint. One thing that I learned when we did the MicroProfile 1.2 release is that even the component releases that we did, like for config 1.0 and fault tolerance 1.0, those really didn't even have to be done from an Eclipse standpoint, because the only one that they're really tracking is the full project release. So I'm sure that doing these type of incremental releases, the 1.0x or 1.1x in order to update the TCKs, that should be relatively straightforward without much process.
This is fine for me, but I'm not quite sure if this, from a lawyer's perspective, with IP, this is somehow weird, because we ship something to the wild, which is not IP checked, and there is no vote or some other IP checking cleaning process involved. Because if you say that it's only for the major microprofile umbrella releases, then yeah, it kind of sounds weird to me, but I'm fine with that. But we should be careful to not ship any stuff and do some internal reviews at least, because this is clearly not covered by the Eclipse process, it seems. But it's legally important to have some reviews of what we ship.
Yeah, I'll have to go back and look, but I didn't think that bug fix releases required IP checks. I thought it was only feature releases.
Well, now unless there's two different flavors of the IP check. And I know that, like, the one for now I'm forgetting off the top of my head, the lighter weight one, it's basically all automated. That just by entering, filing the CQ, the contribution questionnaire, with the information, then it's all automated. Like they do it, like 98% of the time, there's no manual intervention to get those approved. So even if we wanted to do that as just protection for these minor releases, there's nothing stopping us from doing additional process. So, and Mark brings up a good point there that we would hate to accidentally release something that had some IP issues that we don't find for a couple of months.
I like the idea of running it through the lightweight IP process.
And that's what we have been doing with the component releases. So, I mean, we could continue to do that.
Doesn't need to be the official
right thing to do, and it protects the Eclipse Foundation as well.
It doesn't need to be the full Eclipse process. We just have to make somehow sure that we don't ship any stuff we shouldn't ship. That's my whole point, actually. Regardless if we do this internally, we've just make sure that we do reviews before we send a vote or ship something to Maven Central. Because once something hit Maven Central, it's really hard to remove it again.
It's impossible. Sonatype will not remove something that's already in Central.
I was going to say hard is an understatement. It's hard. It's hard to go backwards in time too.
We got Brian drunk, and then it's possible.
Even then.
So what was the decision here?
Yeah. Well, so it sounds like we're talking about the IP part, which I agree is definitely an important piece of this. I'm more concerned, though, about the technical aspects. So right now, each of these are Git repos. Every spec is its own Git repo that's out there. There's no easy way in Maven to release just this one part of the project. And it's very difficult to automate. So if what we're trying to do is move to the new release process, and I don't really want it to block these patch fix releases, if it doesn't make sense to, how do we actually release just the TCK? Especially considering that each of these TCKs are defining a reference to the parent. So that means that both the parent and the TCK have to be out there, unless we change the parent version number of the given TCK.
It's John. I thought about this, and I think I have a solution, or at least I didn't practice this yet, but it should work. Here is the idea: you just take the repository, create a branch with just the TCK in there. So you remove, for example, if you have currently in config, we have the API, the spec with the ASCII docs and the TCK, and then we create a branch. Set the version to, like, say 1.1 -3 or -1. Remove the API and the spec from the project, or either get rid of the directories altogether or just remove them from the POM, the modules, and then do a release in this branch. And then you just have to merge those changes you did to the TCK somehow upstream to the next major version, so we don't lose it.
Yeah, so we would end up doing both, dual maintenance during that time period then.
Yeah, sure, definitely. But it's on the other hand, we only need one repository and have all the stuff in this one repository still. We don't need a separate repository for the TCK.
I have a silly question. From what I'm hearing, if I'm understanding correctly, this is like if fixing issues with the TCK and only the TCK, and the spec itself hasn't changed. I guess my argument would be that shouldn't we do a maintenance release of the whole thing? Because if the TCK is changing, then surely the spec is changing. If only what is required to pass the spec.
Well, so I can explain the config change.
Repo and not seeing the entire, they'd have to know that there's a separate TCK branch that they need to pass for that spec to pass, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's to be like version 1.2 MR3.
So let me explain what the config change is, and maybe we can understand that part a little bit better to better answer your question, Ken. Right now, the config TCK is expecting that you have an object of type duck, which has a single argument constructor in it. And when you don't register the duck converter, you should get an illegal state exception or something along those lines. To test that, they've implemented a duck converter and verify that the duck converter is not registered to the config runtime. Tamaya failed, and actually Open Liberty fails on that TCK test because they use the notion of common sense conversion, where because it has a single constructor with one string attribute, it's able to call that constructor automatically without requiring a converter. The fix would be one of two things. Either as a part of the test, we verify that the converter is never called, or that we change the constructor of duck to have 2 arguments instead of 1 argument. Because within the duck constructor, it's actually splitting the input string into 2 different attributes. That's what we're trying to fix here. We're not trying to make any specification changes. There's no API changes to support that.
Right.
It's just that the test is not really written in a way that verifies the actual expected functionality.
Yeah, sure. I understand that the API and spec haven't changed, but I guess from my perspective, the entirety of the microprofile spec is the combination of API, spec document, and TCK. And if any of those change, then it should be a new version of that microprofile spec. Just because, A, to keep everything aligned so that we don't have, oh, you're trying to pass the TCK for this spec. Oh, by the way, the TCK is actually over here right now because it hasn't been released yet, or it's released under a different name that doesn't match everything else. And it just keeps things cleaner, and that any kind of change requires a release.
I would state that I tend to agree with Ken because it feels weird for us not to release everything. I don't know why we would put effort into not releasing everything. Seems like the challenge is how do we use a version number that just cleanly explains what the change is. But I don't see it.
I tend to agree with Ken and David too, because for the sake of simplicity, it's important to make things simple and still working. And if we release also a maintenance version of the specification or API together with the tests, then it's simple because it's the same thing we've been doing so far. Nothing changes. And second, we can also do very minor fixes to the specification documents or Java docs, for example, like fixing typos or clarifications, which are just a couple of words. And we can do that those things together. So from this point of view, fixing one test in the TCK is very similar than fixing a sentence in a PDF document. And why we should do a different process for fixing TCK than fixing specification on Java docs. So I think it makes sense to release all 3 together and also make clear it's just a minor change. It's not a change in behavior, but more a clarification of the current behavior.
Yeah, I mean, I'm personally fine with that if that's an agreeable solution, and we're saying that the IP overhead is much lower in Eclipse than what we were originally expecting. The downside to this, though, is it creates a ripple effect where we now have to create an updated version of the microprofile jar file to include the transitive dependencies on these new versions of these child SDKs. Or the TCK.
Well, maybe not. I'm just going to bring this up, and I don't know if Java EE is a good example, but Java EE, when they would define the contents for their release, whether it's 6 or 7, they wouldn't update it as the individual specs were being updated. So, a good example is WebSockets. They had an update or was it CDI? One of them had an update that went from 1.1 to 1.2, and the 1.2 version never became part of Java EE7. It was separate. Now that's kind of a major change, but you know, if we wanted to follow that model, if we just had the minor updates and we didn't rev the microprofile specs, maybe that's okay.
I think if we're not updating the spec and we're not changing the requirements of how things are implemented, I think it's fine to use something like a version number like MR. Let's say MR1, MR2.
I think we need to make clear that they're interchangeable. That, let's say, microprofile config 1.1 and 1.1 MR is interchangeable. So if something passes the TCK for 1, it's also okay. And then we don't need to change anything with the microprofile umbrella, because microprofile umbrella specifies that it's compatible or contains config 1.1, and it also automatically should contain any MRs for this version.
I'll give a quick perspective on this. So the change in hand, which is basically that config does not require common sense converters, as John calls them. I think it's a pretty great way of describing them. JAX-RS has common sense converters. The config stuff that I've worked on has common sense converters. No one likes to write converters. It's redundant pain in the butt work. You know, to be honest, having to write converters or editors and register them is like more work than anyone ever wants to do. And 90% of the classes can handle it because they have got a string constructor or a static method that takes a string and returns an instance of that thing. So that aside, the way that I would probably see, in my perspective, this handled is we would do a maintenance release of the current spec that says if you are implementing common sense converters, it shouldn't count against you for your ability to implement config 1.1 and pass TCK. So we would make the change to the TCK so that it doesn't put a strike against someone if it implements common sense converters. And then for config 1.2, we should probably discuss actually requiring them. I don't see a reason why we wouldn't.
Why not? Yeah.
Right. So, you know, the spec change would happen in 1.2. That would be an actual change to implementations that would have to add functionality. That's a new major, that's a change to the TCK and the spec and implementations, all three. And, you know, so that would be config 1.2, but that's a community discussion. The MR, which doesn't require effectively users to make any changes to their dependencies or the implementations don't actually have to change. That's just revving the TCK, so we're kind of making it, you know, we're not punishing people for doing something that isn't mentioned in the specification.
Yeah, I like the idea of.
I apologize for interrupting, but just a time check. We have 2 minutes to go, right?
Yeah.
So just FYI.
I'll just quickly add and say that I like the idea of suffixing the current version with an MR version for those situations where it only impacts the implementers and not the users of the spec.
Yep. Agreed. And that seems to be what the consensus is going for. So I'm fine with that being the approach that we take.
Good.
All right, if someone can capture that in the notes, it would be greatly appreciated.
And I would add that it's not just the implementers are affected, it's that anybody who's already passed the TCK can still pass the TCK without the change. But the people who are having the hard time getting over the hurdle because they're doing something that wasn't anticipated, or the TCK is testing something that isn't actually part of the spec.
Correct.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
So we're not raising the bar on the existing implementations. We're removing an obstacle for some people to be certified, and we don't think that that obstacle is actually a legitimate part of this spec. This is not mentioned or covered.
Okay.
I think if we're going to legitimately raise requirements on vendors, then we probably want to have that be, you know, a 1.2 or something like that, because they're going to have to go back into their already shipped code and change stuff.
Yep. All right. Cool. So that solves that problem for me.
All right, I'm gonna kind of raise my hand here and just say we're at the top of the hour. For any remaining topics, we can either discuss them in the groups or put it in the parking lot for the next meeting. I'd like to thank everyone for joining, and also thanks for taking notes to the note takers. And thanks everyone for joining. These will be posted to the MicroProfile YouTube channel. So thanks everyone.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Bye bye and happy Halloween.
Happy
Oh,
Halloween.
happy Halloween! We missed an opportunity.
Kevin and
Yeah.
John are dressed
To
up as
get
Uber
dressed up.
drivers today.
Yes, exactly.
What happened? You're stuck in a hurricane or just